So hello everyone, my name is Michael Zietz. I'm a second year PhD student in Nick Tatnetti's lab. I'm originally from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is just outside Nashville, and I went to Penn for undergrad. Yeah, so in undergrad I studied physics, which I think while I was doing it was really exciting and really interesting, but in retrospect was probably one of the best choices I think I could have done for what I'm doing now. So physics is a pretty challenging subject, and it has you basically continuously thinking about how to write things down, how to model something, what are the fundamental relationships between various things, and that's been a really helpful way of thinking, sort of starting from sort of a fundamental baseline, what are the ultimate relationships going on here, what sorts of things could be going on, and how to mathematically represent those. So that was very helpful for a number of different subjects. If you're studying computer science or statistics, things like that, a background in physics is super helpful. But for informatics, it's also been very helpful. So for my research, being able to do this kind of modeling, being able to think about mathematical relationships between things, what the sort of variables involved in any given question are and how they relate to one another has been super helpful. Obviously, we're doing informatics, we're not actually doing physics. So, we're not dealing with electrons or anything like that anymore, but the way of thinking was extremely helpful, and it's a very challenging subject. So my recommendation would be, if you're thinking about, you want to go into informatics at some point, I would say doesn't have to be physics, but pick a very challenging subject where you're really being pushed. And then I promise, the classes you'll take later on in master's or in your PhD they'll seem much easier to you if you have a background in really challenging things. In undergrad, I was in this research program where every summer we would basically we were funded to spend the summer doing research in a lab on campus. So originally I was doing computational chemistry research. And that was, it was interesting. There's certainly a lot to be done in that field, but I sort of wanted something a little more health related, more directly involving medicine or applications like that. So I went to a lab that was basically doing genetics research, sort of a machine learning type of lab at the medical school. And I really enjoyed that a lot. It was not an informatics lab, but they were doing lots of really interesting research, and I had a lot of mentorship there that was very important, and a lot of freedom in some sense in the later years, since I was working there for 3 years, in the later years to do my own research, pursue questions sort of in my own way. There was still mentorship, but I had a lot of freedom, and that was great. And my research mentor sort of had a background in informatics, and now he had sort of transitioned a little more into biology. But he recommended a bunch of different programs, and I was looking at different places, and I thought, I like the biological angle, but I also want some training in health records, like actual medical data, not just some large scale experiment that gets set up where you collect certain things. Observational research, I guess, is a better way of putting it. So when I was deciding between programs, ultimately I was deciding between places that are more in some sense theoretical, biological, computational, and places that were more medical focused, informatics. And Columbia, if you want something that's kind of a happy medium, but excellent, faculty and resources for the informatics and the medicine side, Columbia, in my opinion, really can't be beat there. So that made the choice pretty simple for me. But yeah, informatics just kind of came out of thinking about biology, thinking about medicine, statistics, and machine learning, and then thinking, there's a lot of this data. Electronic health records haven't been around for very long in their current form, and so this is a great opportunity, and I think I'd like to work on this. So I'm in Nick Tatnetti's lab, and it's a very exciting lab just because Nick is such a smart guy and interested in so many different things. Many professors have various interests, but I knew I wanted to do something in genetics. I knew I wanted to work with medical records. And Nick is someone who if you told him you wanted to work on a straight up machine learning project and, publish in machine learning conferences, he'd say, awesome. It's just convince me that it's interesting and we'll do it. Or if you want to do biology, you wanted to do medicine, he's a really enthusiastic guy and a great mentor. And there's also several other students in the lab who have interesting things going on, and there's a good bit of synergy, I'd say. People are working on similar things, but slightly different, and no one's really competing with one another. There's just a lot of really interesting things going on. So I'd say the biggest question I'm thinking about, or the thing that interests me the most, is this idea, as of recently, we've been able to sequence people's genetics. We know that many diseases, many traits have a basis in genetics. And the question is, what is the relationship between this genetic sequence that we can obtain and all of the different traits that someone has? So there's been a lot of work in recent years on this. It's something I've kind of been thinking about for a while. It's interesting in a lot of ways. I mean, it's interesting for research, and it's also just sort of interesting to people. How do things emerge if they're genetic? How does that happen? So my research right now is basically a way to increase the power of association tests for determining the relationship between individual genetic variants and traits. So the way this is conventionally done so far is a genome-wide association study, a GWAS. So basically you sequence people, well, in a typical GWAS these days, you're not actually sequencing people yet, you're using a genotyping chip. But in any case, you get genotypes at a bunch of different locations for many different people, and you just one by one compare variants against the trait. So this has uncovered some interesting things, but you need really, really large samples for most complex traits. So most things, it's not like there's a gene for, heart disease or something like that. It's thousands of variants that contribute to these things. And so it's important to have as much power as possible to detect these associations. And so basically what I'm working on is when you have huge data sets like the UK Biobank, or even like a medical record system where you have information on all these different diseases for all these different people, and you have their genetics, how can you leverage all that additional information to boost the power of a study? So for example, in a typical study, you might say, we're interested in the genetics of heart disease. So we're going to collect a bunch of people who we know have heart disease and a bunch of people who we know don't have heart disease, and then we're going to compare their genetics and see what contributes to heart disease. Well, if you have all kinds of other information, like whether these people have had a stroke or have had a heart attack or other things that are related, that actually tells you something about their risk, even if they haven't developed heart disease yet. So this is basically a way to gain more information, get a better understanding of what their true risk is, even if they haven't developed a trait yet. So this is really interesting to me, and we'll see. It's fairly early stages, but I'm really excited by it, and we'll see where it goes. Yes, definitely. So if you're in high school or if you're just entering college, I think the single biggest factor that makes this easier or might make you more interested in it is doing research. So find a lab that you're interested in. Big universities have many, many research labs. That's kind of the fundamental goal of a university, is producing research. So find a research lab that you're interested in with a professor who you get along with, who's willing to take you on, and just do research. So I did research all 4 years of undergrad, and actually in the summers too at different universities. And that was by far the most important aspect of becoming a PhD student in informatics right now, both in my own motivation and my skill in all this. So I'd say, where you go to undergrad it is important. What you choose to study, that is important. Not to discount either of those, but doing research, finding something that you are really interested in, and gaining research experience, working under probably a grad student or a postdoc and being trained is so valuable. In particular for me, if I could just give an example. So I came into college sort of vaguely knowing how to write code. And then in my first year, I was doing this computational chemistry stuff, and I was writing code, and it was okay. But when I joined the lab that I stayed in for the final 3 years of undergrad, I was working with a postdoc who, he and I would go back and forth, and anytime we would write code, we were working on the same project, we would review one another's code, and we would just talk about how we want to do something, how we want to plan something out. And I don't think there was any experience that I've had with respect to research more valuable than that. It brings you to a completely different level, having that kind of mentorship. And there are many people who are generous enough to be willing to share that with you. So absolutely take advantage, try to get some research experience. So as it stands, I'm interested in pursuing a career in academia, becoming a professor, running my own lab. It's still early, so we'll see how that goes. There are also many interesting opportunities in industry these days. There are companies doing super interesting things, and in fact, you'll see excellent researchers leaving academia to go start their own company or something, or going in the other direction. So I think there's great opportunities both places. I'm trying to remain in academia, but I'm open to anything.